Hello, this is Sternguard here. Today we're going to go over the Dwarf faction in Total War Warhammer 3, especially for domination mode. Hopefully, this is a bit more in depth than most guides you'll find out there, so that after learning from both this video and Hitman Hippo's beginner guide, you will have a solid foundation to start really getting into this competitive mode with the dwarves. Obviously, this is just my opinion, and even though I have reached a certain level of success in the competitive scene with the dwarves, obviously stuff can always be improved. Let me mute the sound for now so that you can hear me better. This is how, this guide is going to be structured. First, we will talk generally about the strengths and weaknesses of the faction and what you like to see map-wise for the dwarves. Then we will do a quick roster review. Then at the end we will review a game I played, discuss what I did well, what I did poorly, and talk about how the principles that we talked about earlier in the video apply in a real game. Okay, let's get to it. I want to thank, first of all, both Umais and Grombrindle for their help in researching this video and giving me their opinions. Hopefully I'll make them proud. So, dwarves are obviously known for being a slow, heavily armored and range-focused faction. Unlike other races that rely on mobility and aggressive play, dwarves excel at holding objectives with sturdy frontline units, strong range firepower and relatively powerful artillery. However, their lack of speed, reliance on static formation, and no access to magic make them vulnerable to high mobility factions. The main strengths of the dwarves are the fact that most of their roster has good to high armor and leadership, making it so that the opponent has to budget a good amount of their army into taking out the heavy armor, while terror routes are on average less effective and take a bit more work to set up. Spell resistance. All of our units take 35% less damage from spell, and that's essential since your ability to dodge spells is reduced, since we're kinda slow. The main thing that is often understated about how you must play dwarves is the fact that they have the best, in my opinion, independent shooting in the game. Dwarves range units are both relatively cheap, good at dealing damage, and are sturdy enough to handle themselves versus low power dives. And this is what you will need to leverage most of the time to win games, unless you are doing a very skewed build that takes advantage of a particular niche strategy. Powerful hero squads, talking specifically about the Slayer heroes here. Dwarf heroes are, on average, very sturdy and hit hard, allowing squads of dwarf heroes and lords to present a powerful break that is hard to remove for most opponents. Also, they have powerful artillery. This is self-explanatory, but something that most people don't know is that with the same funds invested, dwarves can, if they focus on it, win any artillery duel in the game. And if you can protect this core of shooting properly, this will carry you into many wins. The last strength I want to talk about that is specific to domination is very high cap weight. Dwarves have no expendable units and no squishy units, aside from rangers, but that doesn't matter. So a legitimate strategy in many situations is just to drown your opponent in cheap sticky units that are difficult to remove while retaining high cap weight on points. The main weaknesses of dwarves are obviously the low mobility and slow speed. Dwarves are the least mobile faction in the game. You have to take this into account while both building your armies and playing the game. We'll talk more about this later. Also, they have average to low killing power on most of our units. Dwarf units are tough and resilient, but their damage output in melee is low, so you have to rely on ranged powerhouses to deal the vast majority of the damage, or on the few damage dealing units like Doomseekers or your heroes. No magic. Magic is for elves and weaklings anyway, so that doesn't really matter. But that also does mean that dwarves are, to some extent, more predictable and have fewer ways to impact the battlefield at a time than other races. Runes obviously can help, and we will discuss them a little bit later. Dwarves also have comparatively weak lords. Sadly, we can forget about the lords carrying the game for us, like Archeon or the Jade Dragons for Cathay. Dwarf single entity units like lords and heroes are slow and ponderous and kill stuff slow, but they can provide some localized utility that can help swing fights if you use them properly. Lastly, high dependence on formation. Our units fight better when they fight together in tight formation, while isolated dwarf units mostly die. That's kind of the general gist of what you should look for while playing dwarves in regards to, you know, if this is a race for you, or maybe you don't really know what you're dealing with while laddering versus a dwarf player, for example. Let's take a little bit of a detour and talk about maps. Since we talked about the fact that dwarves aren't really a mobile faction, obviously you do not want massive maps, which is kinda sadly something that is becoming more of a trend now lately with map makers. I'm calling you out, by the way, all of you map makers. You should start making small maps because I need to win more games. But joking aside, what we are looking for, if you perhaps are in a tournament that allows you to pick races based on maps, is one little cover to hide from your direct fire artillery. That means that not only your cannons can shoot the enemy units, but also their enemy counterfire doesn't really have a way to hide itself from you. You also don't want too much distance between points, not too much distance between spawn and points, because we're slow, as we've talked about before. You might want to look for choke points, and especially the ability to effectively form some kind of a defensive cordon or formation somewhere on the map that can cover multiple angles. This is why, in my personal opinion, people might disagree, and in fact they do disagree, but they're wrong, because I am making the video, so I'm right. The map Crystal Lake is decent or good for dwarves, because it is, even though it's a bigger map, it has relatively, clear and defined lines of engagement, while Proving Grounds, another Total Tavern mod map, is terrible, both because it's long, like Crystal Lake, but because lines of fire and avenues of attack are more difficult to pinpoint exactly, so you need to spread your attention in more places. In general, the fewer places you can focus on, the better as dwarves. There is only one race in this game that can even potentially come close to outgrinding you on one spot, and that is Nurgle if they go for a very specific strategy. Other than that, you do want to consolidate the fight in as fewer places as possible. The most important criteria for dwarves on a map, and judging if the map you are about to play is good for dwarves or not, is this: can I manage to make the battlefield look so that all my units fight together in a somewhat coherent formation? If the answer is yes, then it's probably a decent dwarf map. For example, Battle for Itza is kind of considered the best stereotypical, dwarf map, because if you pay attention, it kind of ticks all of these boxes, right? I have been asked, for example, is it better to have a map with horizontal points in the middle, so you can park your formation between 2 points, or a map with a home objective, to sit back and shoot the opponent off the middle point and then advance after you have accrued value? The reality is that both are fine. It is more important that you can limit how many lines of approach the enemy has to you. For example, Imperial Road, in my opinion, is kinda bad, because the enemy can come towards you from all angles. Let's take a look at it for a second. Ignore the lobby game, doesn't matter. So Imperial Road. So an Imperial Road has a home objective here, a middle objective here, and the enemy's home objective here. Technically, you would think that because you can sort of bunker up here and slowly push into the middle, that's good for dwarves. And it kinda is, but also, if you kind of circle this location as your, the place where you'll be standing, you're giving up all of this space, which many races can, if they're patient enough, especially at a high level, use to envelop you, and that means that you are completely surrounded, meaning you cannot focus fire, you cannot focus the engagement on few points. You have to be ready to fight on all fronts, and that is a lot more important for dwarves than people give it credit for. While, for example, a map that is big and perhaps often considered kind of bad for dwarves is Black Ark. Black Ark has one contested objective here, one home objective here, and one home objective here. It is big, so it's not great, but the lines of engagement are relatively predictable and defined, right? You can either focus on your home objective and the middle objective and basically create like a shape that you can focus on, or shove into the enemy, and so you only have a relatively wide front line and a very predictable flanking area. So it's only two areas that you need to defend, even if they're quite big. Let's take a look at the dwarf roster now. So, talk about lords. First off, the standard dwarf lord is good because he's cheap, sadly, the only really good thing about him is that he's kinda tanky, but even that, not that much. You have the spell resistance, the high armor, the high melee defense. The main way I would advise you run this hero is with the star metal plate, because it deals a pretty substantial debuff that is stacking with other melee attack debuffs, and it also allows you to go much wider in your main army. Other than that, don't really expect much from this lord in the average game. Belegar Ironhammer is essentially a more combat capable dwarf lord with less support. Or rather, it can have more support than the dwarf lord, but you start to get, relatively expensive here. The way I usually play Belegar is only with his Hammer of Angron, which gives him more damage and more melee attack when his leadership is solid, which for dwarves is relatively easy to maintain. So basically, do you want a relatively cheap, very durable lord that doesn't really do much outside of swinging a hammer and slowly killing stuff while not dying? Belegar is for you. The arguably best lord for dwarves is the Demon Slayer. Why is it the best lord? First off, it's the fastest lord that dwarves have. It is relatively squishy because it has no armor, but his melee defense and the fact that he's a foot lord give him a pretty substantial survivability. Always take him with Glorious Death, which is a super underrated ability that can swing whole engagements for you. Giving basically immortality into a 55-meter radius is massive for all Slayer units, especially Demon Slayers who never die are really, really good. And always take the Hammer of Karak Draz. This is a stupid good debuff that is better on the Demon Slayer than any other characters, because the Demon Slayer wants to be in melee to make best use of his high melee attack that allows him to recharge the hammer and constantly be debuffing a key enemy piece. Angrim, take him if you want a more durable Demon Slayer that kinda doesn't do anything besides being a decent combatant. He needs help right now. I really don't recommend him unless you want him because he's cool, which I can understand. Malachi. Malachi is the reason that we talked about before that dwarves can win most artillery duels in the game. In fact, all artillery duels in the game. Malachi by himself is a weak lord who doesn't really do that much damage, but if you stick him in the middle of a shooting corps with his artillery master and Eyes of Grugni abilities, you will get artillery that not only is very damaging, but is also very precise and reloads quicker. So something like this will allow you to outshoot 99% of the other factions in the game. That does mean you have a very squishy lord, but it is unbreakable. And that also means that you are giving up your lord on the front line. So you need to think carefully about this. Next, Grombrindle. Grombrindle is sadly too expensive right now for what he does. I think his MD is also kind of weirdly low for what he's supposed to be, but whatever. What he is the best duelist in the dwarf roster. He's a lord that is, you want him if you want to kill someone and if you want to slow and debuff something around him. That is it. As of right now, the use cases for this are very limited, and I don't really think you should focus on him if you are learning dwarves at a base level. Thorgrim Grudgebearer is, first off, the chaddest of dwarves, who kinda looks like me, by the way, never mind, who is focused on being extremely tanky and providing, with Great Book of Grudges and Hiking, buffs to melee attack and weapon damage to a small area around him. So what you do want is use him in maps and in matchups where you know there will be a blob fights and that the buffs he provides will be useful and he will be kinda relatively safe. So for example, you might want to use him on the map Celestial Lake because there is a relatively safe middle point, safe from shooting middle point, that is often the focus of the whole match. So you can stick 3 or 4 units around him that will all be buffed, and he will kind of safely lead from the front, let's say. In my opinion, the only arguable, best dwarf lord in contention with the Demon Slayer are the Rune Lord because he's cheap, and Thorek Ironbrow. I will talk about them sort of in the same section. These are essentially your wizards. We do not have magic, but we do have somewhat limited effects that we can use at separate cooldowns. So if you have multiple rune priests, they have separate cooldowns for their runes, or let's call them spells, whatever you want to call them, that provide limited but powerful effects. In my opinion, if you want to take Thorek, you might always take Rune of Hearth and Home around him, especially if you want to blob fight, because Vigor Regeneration and Immune to Psychology make dwarf units that are already very, very tough almost unbreakable. And also, all of these runes are usable to some extent, except Rune of Oath and Steel. This is the worst rune in my opinion. Always take 2 runes at least, unless you have a very specific use case for 1 rune and the sort of money you want to spend on the army just cannot work with 2 runes. Because if you take 1 rune, you're gonna waste some time. Basically, how rune cooldown works: if you cast 1 rune, its cooldown is different from the overall cooldown of all runes. So what happens is that you can cast a rune, wait a little bit, then cast the second rune, then wait a little bit and cast the first rune again. Okay? So, in very quick order, Rune of Negation gives you massive damage resistance, so it's excellent for negating alpha strikes. Wrath on Ruin is a very decent explosion damage with decent AP that can be overcasted for even more AP. Rune of Slowness is excellent because it decreases charge bonus and speed, so use it on either cav that is flanking you or a unit that might be trying to get away from you. Speed is not that great, but it can be used if you want to cheese stuff with the Thunderbirds, which is funny. And Rune of Breaking is good when you're facing high armor factions such as Warriors of Chaos or Chaos Dwarfs. Notable items of the Rune Lord and the Thoric aren't really that good, I don't recommend them. The Anvil of Doom provides a significant stat buff for both Thoric and the Rune Lord. Generally, I think Thoric is just overall better because he has more melee attack, melee defense, and magic damage. The Anvil of Doom for Thoric also gives him the Rune of Doom, which is a pretty long cooldown, but causing fear and adding melee attack to your units, which have, on average, high melee defense but lower melee attack, can also be very good. Let's talk about heroes. I'm going to be very quickly, otherwise this is going to take all day. The Thane is just a small dwarf lord. He doesn't really do that much damage, but he's tanky, he's shielded, and he's disruptive, and can take a lot of damage. Use it essentially to send it towards shooting units and occupy the enemy's attention. None of these items really do anything, in my opinion, that justifies their price. The Dragon Slayer is awesome. While the Thane is just decent, the Dragon Slayer is awesome because he is quick, he is a powerful fighter, and he provides reliable AP that will just never break. So bring him naked. If you have to, bring him with Heroic Killing Blow, and he will be a stalwart, killer of anything large, especially if you bring him with his body, the other Dragon Slayer. Speaking of durable, you might want to add Felix to your death squad. So you can do something like this, like if you want to get a start with dwarves, these two units plus whatever lord you want, except perhaps the Malachi, will make a very solid and reliable core that will outlast most opponents. Felix will deal good damage to infantry and will heal the other single entities, providing them with lots of vigor and staying power. However, you must be careful because Felix, despite being a powerful combatant, has a lot less leadership and armor than other dwarves, so he will break a lot quicker. Garagrim. Garagrim is, in my opinion, a more offensive Dragon Slayer with the big upside of magic attacks, anti-infantry instead of being anti-large, and this powerful ability which is called the warhmmer. Warhmmer gives a pretty big buff of both, weapon damage, AP to all units around them, and it gives them magic attacks, which means that if you're facing an army such as vampire counts or demons that have many units with phase resist, you can circumvent this with a blob of Garagrim. He is, however, quite squishy, so you might want to control him a bit more carefully. The Master Engineer. The Master Engineer is kind of a support hero. I don't really like him at all. He's basically a worse Malachi with the only upside that he has Flash Bomb, the same item as Grombrindle, which does mean he can protect artillery better than Malachi, but he buffs artillery less. Restock is very limited. The use cases for restocking your artillery are super low in Domination. Generally, if your artillery just gets to a point where they need to restock, you either already won or you already lost. So if you want to bring him, just bring him naked or with Flashbang and maybe Fiery Ring of Thori versus Undead, but in general I don't recommend it because his shooting attack is also kind of low range. The Runesmith is the hero version of the Um, Rune Lord, not much to say here. Worse stats, same spells. He does have the armor of Karakdraz. However, I don't really like it on the Rune Priest, on the Runesmith, sorry, because the Dragon Slayer, the Demon Slayer, wow, I can't speak. The Demon Slayer is a powerful combatant. The Runesmith will die to a stiff breeze despite the high armor. So he's not safe in melee combat, where the wielder of the hammer wants to be to recharge it. Last but definitely least is Gotrek. Do you like Dragon Slayers? If you do like Dragon Slayers, but you want them more expensive for very little gain, then pick Gotrek. Otherwise, just play with Dragon Slayers. Units. Miners are super cost-effective chaff that has high armor, armor piercing, kinda bad combat stats, but they are very good for targeting opponents' charges, for stacking up your cap weight on points, and especially for their blasting charges. Blasting charges are very powerful explosive that have only one-time use, except if you have the Regiment of Renown, which has 3 uses of blasting charges that can reduce even mid-tier units to dust very quickly. They also have Vanguard, which is very important for dwarves, so I would recommend most mid to beginner level dwarf players to start with at least 4 miners of blasting charges between the ROR and normal ones, because they will serve many useful purposes. They will not win many fights, but they will occupy the opponent and destroy stuff with their blasting charges. Vanguard means they get 2 points quicker, and the ROR is also a pretty decent fighter with Frenzy. Warriors with great weapons, Longbeards and Longbeards with great weapons are obviously your main core infantry units. Nothing much to say here. They are the stereotypical dwarf units, high toughness, high armor, high melee defense. They will hold. Obviously the Longbeards more so than the normal dwarves. They will not do that much damage. They're kind of slow. The only things you need to think about here are the fact that the great weapon variants are generally kind of bad, especially the Longbeards kind of pay a bit too much for what they get, while the Dwarf Warriors being cheaper with great weapons, you can kind of spam them, especially versus Cathay or Chaos Dwarves. The other thing is, Longbeards actually have this very useful ability called Old Grumblers, and they are immune to psychology, which means that Old Grumblers gives a leadership buff to units around them. So what you can usually do for a front line that I like to do is, for example, have a front line of Dwarf Warriors with 1 or 2 Longbeards in between 2 or 3 units of warriors, so they get the improved leadership. Also remember that most of your units, melee units, have charge defense versus large, so brace them if the opponent is sending cavalry at you to deny charge damage. The Warriors of Dragonfire Pass and the Grumbling Guard are decent ROR, but don't really provide that much damage or utility for their price. Between fire damage makes them useful versus healing, but not really something that must be picked, while the Grumbling Guard is just too expensive for what it does, and what it does is it gives vigor replenishment for units around them. One of the best and core units for dwarves are Slayers. Slayers are quick, low armor, unbreakable, anti-large infantry, and how you use Slayers is usually sort of like the hallmark of what a good dwarf player is, in my opinion. You have to use them to counter enemy large units or to target engagements, because none of these guys will ever run or break. The thing is, as with all dwarves, your decisions and your positioning matter more than your micro and your split-second decisions. Your game plan decisions matter more. So they are fast, but they're still slower than the units they want to counter. So you need to have them in position before the use case for them appears on the battlefield. You cannot see a cav unit charging your range units and then say, oh, I should summon up my slayers. The slayers must already be in position or you kind of failed. The ROR has better stats and gives fire weakness and slows, while giant slayers have generally more offensive power and AP, but are somewhat squishier. Obviously they pair really well with the Demon Slayer because it gives them all immortality, but in general you never want to leave home with at least 3 slayers somewhere in your army. I like them in reinforcement better because they are quicker on their feet than other dwarves, but to each their own. Hammerers! They're bad. Please don't use them. They are an offensive unit that gives up way too much survivability for middling offensive stats. I'm sorry, you're very cool, but don't use them. You might use the ROR, the Big Gay Guard, somewhere against Demonic or Chaos faction, because these guys will legitimately beat a lot of stuff down, but while you're learning dwarves, ignore them. These guys won't really do anything for you. Iron Breakers are the super elite defensive infantry of the dwarves, and they're also factually the best looking dwarf units. You use them if you want a super defensive unit that can deal damage through its blasting charges, and the ROR also has Vanguard, so I love it in reinforcements because it can get to the battlefield relatively quickly. These guys will essentially just never break, so use them on choke points against factions that can't really delete them with infantry. Sorry, with artillery. The ROR also has very powerful blasting charges. These guys are the ultimate line holders in the game, and I like to shun them in as many armies as possible, even when they are not optimal, because they are the quintessential dwarf unit, in my opinion. Where do you want to use them? On maps where you can make sure that if you stick an Iron Breaker in perhaps like a side alley or a choke point, nothing gets through. Okay? It's neither cav nor infantry units. Doomseekers are anti-infantry super slayers. They are excellent combatants that are kinda squishy, so vulnerable to range fire and cav charges, but they will melt every infantry unit in the game with comparable resources invested into them, aside from the OP stuff that is now coming in the game. They also have a very peculiar ability that is surprisingly strong versus cavalry, which is called Whirlwind of Death, which reloads while they are in melee. It does a really good amount of damage. They are especially good versus demons and furies. Also they have Vanguard, which gives them an essential and important role in the dwarf roster, because we are slow, so everything that has Vanguard, which means they can go to the battle quicker, becomes even more important for us than other races. The best part of the dwarf roster is the missile infantry. Rangers and quarrelers with great weapons, rangers with great weapons, are all powerful crossbow units, except for these guys which have like axes, but whatever. They are powerful range units with a decent amount of AP, even if it doesn't say that in the profile. They have good reload speed, decent survivability. Obviously the quarrelers have more armor but do not have Vanguard. Rangers have Stalk and Vanguard, so are quicker but less stocky and less durable, but can surprise the opponent because they will only reveal themselves when the opponent is really close. These units are the bread and butter of any dwarf army. This is shown even in Mancipo's beginner build, which focuses a lot on these types of units. these are the damage dealers of the average dwarf army. They are tough, and do not underestimate the great weapon rangers, even if they are stats-wise kinda bad compared to the crossbow and shielded versions. They do surprising amount of AP damage with their axes. They shoot kinda fast, and I really love the Ulthar's Raider ROR. They have a really powerful ability which is called Mark by Ulthar, which is a super strong debuff, which compared with your other shooting makes what you're focus firing melt in seconds. If you can, stick these guys somewhere in your army, especially against factions that rely on heavy armor. Iron Drakes. Iron Drakes with flamers, Trollhammer torpedoes, and the Sternguards. Trollhammer torpedoes are, after the rework, you can all see they all have really high armor and pretty good defensive stats. So these are tough to tie down and kill with low AP units. Torpedoes are, they basically are these are your dwarf weapons teams. Torpedoes are excellent in my opinion. They have pretty good range, AP, powerful missiles that are excellent versus large, and as we will see later, but do surprisingly well into armored infantry in general. The downside is that they are relatively immobile, and they require protection. They also benefit a lot from Malachite's buffs. The Sternguard is sadly a bit too overcosted, but it does have interesting use cases versus armored infantry. It will melt everything around it, but it has very low range, so you need to protect them especially hard. I personally wouldn't recommend them though. The Iron Drakes with flamers have excellent damage output, and their flames really do a number on enemy leadership, which makes them excellent versus low leadership factions and demons, because you both get them to crumble quicker and you deal a lot of damage in a single blow. Their low range, however, makes them really hard to use in domination maps, especially the newer super large maps. I am experimenting a bit with basically having only one flame Iron Drake in the middle of my formation that can spew its flames on stuff that tries to dive you, but in general I do not recommend using flamers as an offensive units, while the torpedoes are easier to use. Thunderers and Thunderers Grudgerakers are essentially a handgun units that is more resilient, especially to spells, and shotgun units. They are very self-explanatory, good AP shooting, very good AP shooting, but very low range. The Grudgerakers especially are very good at protecting your backfield, and more so the ROR, the Green Delvers, which not only have Vanguard, which we have spoken of before, it's extremely important for dwarves. They also have Stalk, which means they might take people by surprise, have a very powerful range attack, and have Frenzy, which means that they can hold their own against low-powered dives, but they won't be beating like heavy cav on the charge or something like that. But they might do good work versus light cav. The last range units I want to talk about are the Slayer Pirates. All Slayer units are unbreakable and have zero armor, as we have spoken of before. Slayer Pirates focus on being a hybrid unit that has good shooting and decent melee stats. They have actually the same exact profile as normal Slayer, but they have a bit less weapon strength, so they will handle themselves in melee, but they will lose their strength very quickly. Use them essentially to soften up enemy units with no shields. That's the main thing. The ROR is an extremely good unit that debuffs the melee attack of units around them. They're also fast, so this combo is really good in my opinion. You get the Star Metal Plate on the Lord and the Dwarf Ram on the ROR for a very respectable -13 melee attack on a blob fight, for example. I wouldn't really leave home without the long-drawn Slayer pirates in most of my armies. Gyrocopters are essentially the main way that dwarves can project their force on faraway points of the map. You can think of them as your flying skirmish cav with no cap weight. They all have their uses. Flame gyros are very powerful into infantry and low power and low leadership factions because they demoralize units. Their bombs are kinda but they do their job. Normal gyrocopters are powerful armor-piercing units, so use them against elite cav and elite infantry. They will rack up value really quickly. Obviously, they do not have cap weight, but they soften up the enemy units and divert their attention elsewhere, so that they cannot envelop you as easy. Bombers are kinda bad. They give up a lot of their ammo and their range shooting power for their bombs, but they are a bit too slow in my opinion, and they have so little ammo. Their shooting isn't that good. The Skyhammer Squadron though has really good bombs that spread out and can devastate multiple infantry units at the same time, so I recommend them against factions that can't really shoot up but bunch up a lot. So Norska or Greenskins, for example. The most controversial dwarf unit is the Thunderbarge, which is essentially a super slow, super tanky, almost unbreakable weapons platform that flies. A lot of people hate this unit, a lot of people love this unit. The reality is that most of the time this is a meme unit. It will not work on any map that is even remotely not small, or that has points far away from each other, or if you're facing a faction that has any amount of reliable range damage. You can, however, use it if you want to surprise your opponent, because it can rack up stupid amounts of value. The main things I want to tell you about the barge is that it synergizes very well with both Malachai's healing item, which is called Machaison's Persuader, and the Rune Lords and the Rune Smith's Rune of Negation and Rune of Speed items. Usually the Thunderbarge will take most of your opponent's attention, so if they focus their artillery on it and you can both heal it and give it minus 40% damage on it, it will outlast almost any opposition. If you want to build with the Thunderbarge, the best way, in my opinion, is to have an army that is focused on the barge in this way. Your lords and heroes protect the barge, your units swarm the points. So let's say, for example, this is just something I'm coming up on my own 2 feet. This is not an optimized build, but just to show you. Machaison Persuaders to heal, the Runesmith protects it. You want a couple of units to make sure that nothing gets close to the barge, and then you drown your opponents in as many bodies as you can, because you're giving up a lot of value at the start to have essentially nothing that can capture the point. So something like this, maybe, well, I don't really need that much. Something like this, for example. You will drown your opponent in bodies on the points, and these units are sticky enough that they can hold while the Thunderbarge kills everything and is protected and healed by your heroes and lords. Lastly, let's talk about artillery. This section has been going on for way too long. I apologize, but I wanted to be thorough. The ball throwers are low damage, mid-range, AP artillery that has its main advantage in being hard to remove. Because it has 8 models, the damage done to it is usually spread between the models, so it is more resistant to dives than most other artillery units. It does, however, mean that it can stay online longer, and it has a cheap price, so I recommend at least one bow thrower in most matchups. I can't say the same about the grudge thrower. The grudge thrower is just kind of a bad artillery piece. you don't really need it. Other stuff in your roster does the same thing. It doesn't even have the upsides of the ball thrower, which is being resistant to dives. A good artillery piece is, however, the ROR grass thrower. This unit does a lot of damage. It has a leadership debuffing trait that stacks with the normal artillery debuffing attacks, which means that it can rout even mid-tier units very fast. So consider it if you want to pepper infantry units from afar. Cannons are very powerful against cavalry and single entities. They are precise, they are long range, they pack a punch. Bring them if you want to kill tanks, cavalry, or single entities. Organ guns are a very cool unit that doesn't really work. I don't know if you can call it a bug, but they don't really seem to perform that well because they target only one model in a formation. So unless you want to have fun, ignore them for now. They also have kind of low range. Flame cannons are essentially what, in my opinion, what the Iron Drakes with Flamers wish they were. Their increased range means that not only they are safer because they usually are relatively far away from the battlefield, but they can be safer while they destroy heavy infantry and light infantry at the same time with their flame debuffs. They do have, however, very low hit points, so you need to protect them very well, and they will lose hard to any amount of counterfire from artillery. Goblin Hewers are still being experimented on. I think they can be used in a couple of matchups, for example against ogres. They are essentially, you can consider this unit like half a slayer that has a super big blasting charge attached to it. You will use it if you want to go up to a point, unload its payload, which will delete almost anything that isn't a big single entity in very few seconds, and then you also incidentally have a bit of cap weight and a unit on the point. It has a super high damage, but it can be, because it needs to be near the front line, it can be tied down a lot easier than most other artillery pieces. So it weirdly needs protection in some ways, even though its main selling point is that its crew is an infantry unit. They can effectively kill stuff. So I think it's a bit of a unit that suffers from it's incoherent in its design, but it can be used, in my opinion, as a one-off in reinforcements. But that's about it. As a final tip, before watching the game, and then I will set you free, I'm sorry, I wanted to give you 4 tips to be a better dwarf player. First thing is, be patient. Let the enemy come to you, use artillery and range firepower to force engagement. You can rush people with dwarves, you can be offensive, but that takes a bit more matchup knowledge and skill, while it is much safer to develop yourself as a competent dwarf player to adopt a more defensive posture. Use terrain. Elevation helps your range units, while choke points protect your flanks and allow your tougher, stronger, tankier units to shine. It doesn't matter if you have the tankiest unit in the game if the opponent can just ignore them, so use choke points to your advantage. Always have a plan for fast units. Slayers and Miners and Bugman's Rangers, which are a particular variant of Rangers which have charge defense versus large and a small heal over time, are essential to counteract cavalry rushes and being able to effectively enact your game plan. Never overextend. If you push too far, you'll never be able to retreat in time. Dwarves are a faction that punish bad decisions more than bad second-to-second gameplay. Some people hate dwarves because they think they take no skill. This is a completely wrong statement. It's just that the skill set required to play dwarves is different than the skill set required to play aggressive factions. Dwarves reward matchup knowledge, planning, and meticulousness, I hope that's a word, more than fast clicking and big flashy plays. Lastly, we will talk about what we have discussed in relation to a game I have recently played in a tournament against RTK Elvio, who is a really good player. This was a semi-final play-in of a recent tournament. Let's see if you can apply what we have talked about while I sort of explain. I will also try to emphasize both what I did very well and what I did wrong. Let's start with matchup knowledge. Ogres are a fast, tough faction that relies on smashing into your front line and outtrading you, while constantly healing and generating value with routing units through their army ability. What that means generally is that I have the shooting advantage that I can further emphasize with Malachi. That also means that it is very likely that I will not be able to quickly contest the points, both because their units are faster and 1-to-1 they will beat mine. So I need to adapt a more conservative strategy. Let's look at the map. This is the map called Jade Tomb. Let's see about what we've talked about before. What do you think about this map as a dwarf player? Well, it's big. It's a big map. It's a very long map, which means that the ogre player has an advantage in its travel speed. But it also has essentially only one avenue of attack, which is a massive front line. So I know that he will only be coming from here. Although he is quite smart and sneaky and tries a bit of a flank, but ogres are fat, so I see it. What does that mean? It means that I can focus my attention on as few places as possible and leverage my shooting advantage. There is also relatively little elevation, which means my direct fire units are especially powerful here. As you can see, I have brought a very big ranged core of 3 iron drakes with torpedoes and 2 bolt throwers. All of this stuff is powerful anti-large, which will hopefully whittle out the more powerful ogre units so that they can be destroyed while they waste time attacking my my quite elite Longbeard front line. Let's start the game. A very important thing, by the way, if you're using Malachi, is to keep him at the center of your range formation, because he needs to be close to your units in order to buff them. I will not do a play-by-play, just we are simply looking for mistakes and ideas and tactics. Now Elvio correctly recognizes the situation, which is I have the shooting advantage, so he needs to somehow try to counteract this, and he tries to do it with a big flank. We have talked about the importance of terrain. I cannot effectively shoot while he's in the trees, so he tries essentially a double-prong flank attack with carrions and his single entity units while shoving me back. Another thing that we haven't talked about is that a good tactic against dwarves is essentially to shove into them as hard as possible, as Elvio does here, so that even if I win in the value trade, my slow speed means that I can't really get into the points quick enough, so that eventually I'll just lose on points. And I believe this was Elvio's plan here. Another important thing is target acquisition. The most important things to kill here are the lead belchers and the single entities. I do a pretty good job of shutting down the lead belchers, but something you will see later is that Focus fire is something that I don't really do well here, because leadership is tied not only to how much damage you do to a unit, but how quickly you do it. If you can focus multiple range units into a key enemy piece, you will route it much quicker, and that is also another skill that you must master as a dwarf player. As you can see, I space out my range units so that they can cover for each other. I quickly summon a Slayer to protect artillery, which is something I recommend you all do, and I start focusing the most important enemy units, so the Stonehorn and the Lead Belcher. His flank is unsuccessful here because of the tactic I explained before, so crossfires with Trollhammers and the Grim Delvers, while I intercept the other dive with Slayers, even though he still managed to do a little bit of damage. At this point, I am way ahead. He has committed to an attack that has largely failed. He has lost a 1000 point value unit for nothing, but I get overconfident and Elvio punishes me for it. I need to focus my fire more, while what we've talked about is now in full effect. I need to use all of these units to focus on as few places as possible, but if you can see, I have one unit shooting Blood Vultures, one Bow Thrower shooting this Lead Belcher, one Iron Drake shooting this Lead Belcher, together with this Bow Thrower, and one other shooting unit which isn't doing anything. So these are 3 or 4 different targets. It will be much more beneficial to me to have 2 units for each enemy threat. That way they can switch between each other and just focus on the capturing the map side. The sort of the points of the map. The Stonehorn does really good damage on the charge, and my front lay units is doing what dwarves do best, which is holding but not really doing any damage. So he doesn't really, my opponent doesn't really need to care about his units as long as they're in melee, right? So he can focus all of his attention on dispatching my carry pieces, meaning my shooting pieces. So you can see he constantly threatens them and eventually whittles them down. Even though he's at a value deficit, then I am now being triple capped, which means I need to not only repel him, but also quickly put my sort of reach on the map as quickly as possible. Otherwise, even if I wipe him off the map, I will not be able to defeat him in time. We have talked about the map before, but as you can see, this, like, everything is happening essentially into this axis, which does help me a little bit. If I had units coming constantly from this side and this side, this would be a lot harder for me, but the map doesn't really allow it. So I am able to sort of solidify my fire bases and add more fire power to my overlapping fire bases as the game goes on. I slowly am able to extend my reach into the map and start accruing victory points. Again, be very careful. Like this is a big mistake I make. The Stonehorn has been a thorn in my side and will still be a thorn in my side the whole game. I should be having all of these units routing it off the map immediately. Instead, I don't. This unit isn't doing anything. This unit is, I don't know, admiring the sights. This unit is doing the correct thing. This is doing the correct thing. And all of this stuff is now essentially tied down by kind of bad units. Malachi should be helping shooting, but I'm not. This is a big mistake I make. But you can see that Trollhammers are really, really good versus Ogres, as is shooting in general. Really good job by Elvio to essentially avoid my front line and try to get into the proverbial cookie jar, but I do manage to defend. You can see that I'm slowly capturing my points. I'm slowly starting to remove his problem units, but the the points lead for Elvio is quite problematic. I also forget about these units here. They should already be moving up. The scope of the map and planning like 2 minutes ahead is also another big thing for dwarves. You can see that the Stormhorn just doesn't really care about being peppered piecemeal. This is what I meant to say. The leadership break is now in full effect. The damage, the value differential is just way too big. He cannot possibly keep me in my spawn anymore. So I now try to push him off the map. But I do need probably a trip. Like, I'm sure there's math about this, but in the moment I felt like I needed the triple cap to win. But all of these units are way back and they are slow. They need to get here to meaningfully affect the battlefield. I should have moved them up a little bit earlier because they had the cover of Slayers, but this was a big mistake and I will suffer the consequences. While the opponent can just summon tanky units that are quick and so can affect the battlefield much more quickly. Much quicker? More quickly? Whatever. English is stupid. Look at the state of the battlefield now. I am slowly starting to essentially form what I wanted at the beginning, which is a solid rock of stuff that can shoot him off in all directions. But it took a long time. My army was kind of scattered into a bit of a sea at my spawn for most of the game, which means that projecting my force outward is going to be a problem. This is another mistake I make. As we've talked about before, isolated dwarf units die, and even if this is a favorable trade by me, I need cap point more than he does at this point, so I could have waited a little bit, consolidate more, and then push, which is something that Elvio does correctly in a minute. He recognizes that I am now flooding in, and he needs like a backup plan to contest this objective for as long as possible. More Slayers are coming in, I'm routing everything, which this might look like a mistake, and it is in how long I take to do it, but it is the correct play. I route this stuff off, which again, what does this mean in the battlefield? The front line is now one exact point, which is here, which means that all of my resources can go into this point, which is usually what you want as dwarves, because if basically this a game becomes a headbutting contest, I win. Again, it's a mistake. I need to move my units up. I don't, because I was a bit flustered, and now my units are doing the correct thing, but are doing it one at a time, feeding value to my opponent when I could have won much more easily. But Elvio is correctly recognizing this, and essentially, I believe Turin's calls this a ham's deep situation. He just needs to ward me off this point, and he will likely win. Essentially, there are no more tactics here to be displayed, no more big concepts. I believe I have said everything that I needed to say. Elvio played quite well. We both made a bit of mistakes, but I think the game was really fun. It was really close. Essentially what happens now is that I throw all of my cap weight onto the point. As we've talked about before, we do have high cap weight, and I eventually win the game. But this could have been much more much cleaner, if I hadn't committed the mistakes that I did at the time. But he was really good at putting pressure on me, so I needed to adapt on the fly. Now let's fast forward through the game just to show you. Now the triple cap has been reversed, but this will not be an easy hold for me. Ogres are very powerful. I throw Malachi into the fray simply to have more cap weight on the point. These two units are just, I forgot about them. My bad, I should have been putting them on the point. if you can, always take at least a miner on each of your points to avoid backups, which you cannot react to quickly as dwarves. And now the game basically ends. I managed to outshoot my opponent, force him into a favorable engagement on one point that, even though I had to rush out and then maybe do not as optimally as I wanted, was still something that played to the strength of my faction rather than his. And I believe he will soon give up. I believe I throw my bolt thrower into melee as well. Yeah, these guys will come into melee because I'm dumb. Just unsummon them and bring out more units. But now the game is over, and with the game being over, this guide is also over. If this is something you appreciate, I will try doing it with more factions that I'm comfortable with. I hope that this was useful and not too long. I hope that my English isn't too bad, that you found this both entertaining and formative. If not, I'm really sorry. Hopefully we'll meet again in a tournament. Ciao!